By the 2nd of October 1918, the 77th Division of the American Expeditionary Forces had pushed nearly a mile deep into the Argonne Forest. Their orders were unambiguous. Advance, regardless of flanking units. Hold the ground at all costs. Within 36 hours, 554 American men would be surrounded on three sides by German infantry, cut off from supply, cut off from communication, cut off from any army that could reach them. The official histories called it a tactical, the men inside it called it something else. By the morning of October 7th, only 197 of those 554 men could still walk. The records show what the casualty reports could not. Their notes, written on scraps of paper and passed between dugouts in the ravine, describe a kind of waiting that has no name in any military manual. They knew the artillery falling on them was American. They knew the runners they sent for help were not coming back. They knew that the white flag carried up the slope on the fifth day was not an offer of mercy. These were men from the tenement blocks of New York City, Italian, Polish, Jewish, Irish, many of them not yet citizens of the country they were dying for. Their commanding officer was a Wall Street lawyer who had never wanted to fight a war. These are the 6 days of the Lost Battalion the men history nearly forgot. To understand what happened in the Charlevoix ravine, you must understand the ground. The Argonne forest in the autumn of 1918 was not a forest in any peaceful sense of the word. 4 years of artillery had splintered its oaks into jagged stumps. 4 years of rain had turned its slopes into slick channels of mud. The Germans had held this ground since 1914. They had wired it, mined it, and dug machine gun nests into every ridge that overlooked a ravine. General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, had chosen this terrain as the opening sector of the largest offensive in American military history. The Meuse-Argonne. Over 1.2 million American soldiers would fight there in 47 days. 26,000 of them would not come home. The 77th Division was a New York unit. The press called it the Statue of Liberty Division. Its ranks were filled with men from the Lower East Side, from Brooklyn, from the Bronx, recent immigrants, garment workers, dock laborers, the sons of men who had crossed the Atlantic with everything they owned in a single suitcase. Many of them spoke English as a second language. Some did not speak it at all. Their orders, signed by 1st Army Headquarters on October 2nd, were straightforward. Advance northward through the Argonne. Take the heights above the Aire River. Do not stop because the units on your left and right have stopped. The man who would carry that order forward was Major Charles White Whittlesey, 34 years old, a graduate of Williams College and Harvard Law, a Wall Street attorney who had specialized in railroad bonds. Tall, thin, and bespectacled, he wore a soft expression that his men described as kindly. He had never asked to command a battalion in combat. He had asked to be assigned to a desk in intelligence. The army had refused. On the morning of the 2nd of October 1918, Major Whittlesey assembled the men of the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 308th Infantry Regiment, along with attached companies from the 306th Machine Gun Battalion and the 307th Infantry. 554 men in total. He read them their order. Then he led them into the ravine. The order Whittlesey carried into the Argonne that morning had been signed by Brigadier General Evan Johnson the night before. It contained a single inflexible phrase. The advance will be pushed without regard to losses and without regard to the exposed condition of the... Whittlesey had read that phrase twice in his dugout by candlelight. He had asked for clarification. He had asked whether the units on his left and right, the French 38th Corps to the west and the American 28th Division to the east, would be advancing in line with him. They would not. By 0830, his men were moving up the slope of hill 198 inches single file along an old logging track. The undergrowth was so dense that men 20 yards apart could not see each other. German snipers had been firing intermittently since dawn. 2 men of Company E were already dead before the ravine. By noon, the battalion had advanced 1.5 kilometers. Whittlesey sent runners back to confirm that his flanks were keeping pace. The runners did not return. By dusk, his men were dug into the northern face of a ravine below Charlevoix Mill, a long, shallow depression in the forest floor, perhaps 300 yards from end to end and 40 yards wide. They were the only American unit that had. At 2100 hours, Whittlesey ordered Captain Nelson Holderman to send a patrol back along the line of advance to establish contact with the rear. The patrol left at 21:15. At 21:40, The patrol leader returned alone, bleeding from the shoulder. The track behind them was no longer American ground. German infantry of the 2nd Landwehr Division had closed the gap behind the 308th. The battalion. Whittlesey did not announce this to his men. He simply ordered the perimeter tightened, the machine guns repositioned to face all 4 points of the compass, and the wounded gathered into the deepest part of the ravine. The forest above them went quiet. Somewhere in the dark, a diary entry from Private Lowell Hollingshead of Company H, written by the light of a covered match that first night, describes what the men understood without being told. He had been an Ohio farm boy 3 months earlier. He wrote, "We are in for it now." Hollingshead was 19 years old. He would survive the pocket. He would never sleep through a full night again for the rest of his life. By midnight on October 2nd, the casualty count inside the perimeter stood at 50. 504 men remained. At 0600 on October 3rd, Whittlesey's men woke to a sky they could not see. Mist had filled the ravine to the height of a tall man's shoulders. The wounded who had survived the night were gathered along the northern bank in shallow scrapes lined with damp leaves. There was no morphine. There was no clean water. The medics had used the last of their. The first German trench mortar round fell at 0640. It killed 3 men of Company K and wounded 11 more. By 0800, the entire perimeter was under sustained fire from 3 sides. The Germans had moved up Minenwerfer heavy mortars during the night and registered them precisely on the American positions. Each round destroyed roughly 4 square yards of cover. The men called them stovepipes for the slow tumbling. At 1100 hours, a German officer carrying a white handkerchief stepped onto the southern lip of the ravine. He shouted in clear English that the American commander should consider his position. He was told the offer would be relayed. The officer waited 15 minutes. No reply came. He saluted. Whittlesey had not, in fact, relayed anything. He had simply told the runner to wait. He did not believe in negotiating with men who had cut his battalion in half. By the end of October 3rd, another 41 men were dead. The pocket now held 463 living soldiers and a growing number of bodies that could not. By dawn on October 4th, the battalion had been without resupply for 52 hours. They were rationing the last of their hard biscuits, 2 per man per day, and drinking from puddles strained through handkerchiefs. The men had begun to scavenge ammunition from the dead. Whittlesey wrote in his command journal that the situation required immediate communication with division. He sent runners. He sent them in pairs and alone, by daylight and by dusk, carrying maps drawn on the inside of cigarette packets and pleas folded into tobacco tins. Not one of them returned. The Army Air Service had been listening on the wireless since the morning of October 3rd. At 1400 hours on October 4th, 2 airmen of the 50th Aero Squadron volunteered to drop supplies into the pocket by air. Their names were First Lieutenant Harold Gettler, pilot, and Second Lieutenant Erwin Bleckley, observer. Their aircraft was a DH-4, a slow, fabric-covered biplane built for daylight reconnaissance, not for the kind of low-altitude flying the mission. They flew the first run that afternoon. The terrain forced them down to 200 feet. They could not find the pocket. They returned to their airfield, refueled, and went up. On the second pass, German machine gunners on the surrounding ridges fired into them at point-blank range. The DH-4 came down inside French lines. Gettler was dead in the cockpit when ground crews reached him. Bleckley was carried to a French field hospital and died of his wounds before nightfall. Neither man had been able to confirm the location of the men they were trying to save. Gettler was 28. Bleckley was 24. Both received the Medal of Honor. Both received it after they were. By nightfall on October 4th, the German artillery had registered every yard of the pocket. The men dug deeper. The dead were no longer being buried. There was no ground left. The 504 had become 463. 463 had become 379. At 1600 hours on October 4th, the 305th Field Artillery Regiment received a corrected map reference from division headquarters. The reference indicated the suspected position of a German concentration in a ravine north of Charlevoix Mill. The map reference, the first salvo of 75mm shells landed on the pocket at 1610. They came in over the southern lip of the ravine and burst among the wounded gathered along the northern bank. Whittlesey was at his command dugout when the first round detonated 30 feet from his position. He stood up, brushed the dirt from his uniform, and asked the nearest sergeant. The sergeant did not answer. The sergeant was no longer there. For 1 hour and 20 minutes, the American artillery walked its barrage across the pocket. Trees splintered. Stretcher cases were buried where they lay. Men who had survived 3 days of German shelling were torn apart by the guns of their own division. Whittlesey ordered every able runner to attempt to reach the artillery liaison post and report the error. None made it more than 50 yards before being killed or driven. Inside his command dugout, Whittlesey reached for the last resource the battalion possessed, a wooden cage. Inside the cage were 8 homing pigeons of the United States Army Signal Corps. 2 had been killed in the German barrage that morning. 3 more had been sent earlier in the day and had never reached their lofts. Whittlesey wrote out the message in pencil on a scrap of cigarette paper. He rolled it into the aluminum capsule fastened to the bird's leg. He carried the cage to the lip of the dugout. The first 2 pigeons released on the afternoon of October 4th were killed by German rifle fire within seconds of taking flight. The 3rd pigeon was a black check cock, bred in England, registered with the United States Army Signal Corps under the leg band number NERP 18 EAD 615. The handlers called him. The message tied to his leg was the last appeal Whittlesey would make to his own army. It read in full, and these are the words exactly as they reached divisional headquarters that evening. We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop! Cher Army rose from the lip of the ravine and was almost immediately struck by German fire. Witnesses on the ground reported him falling, then climbing, then falling again. A bullet had passed through his breastbone. Another had nearly severed his right leg, the leg holding the aluminum capsule. He flew 25 miles. When he landed at the loft of the 77th Division Signal Corps at Rampont, the message capsule was still attached to him by a tendon. He was blind in one eye. He weighed less than 5. The artillery stopped at 17:30. By that time, 80 more Americans were dead inside the pocket. The casualty count stood at 245 living men. Cher Army was carried back to the United States by General Pershing personally the following year. He died of his wounds at the Signal Corps loft in New Jersey 8 months later. His body was preserved and is held today in the Smithsonian Institute. If you have made it this far, you understand. This is not a war story. This is the record of what 1 battalion of immigrant boys from New York endured in a ravine the size of a city block. Stay with me. The man at number 4 is the one who refused to surrender. By the morning of October 7th, the 6th day inside the pocket, the battalion had been reduced to a perimeter approximately 100 yards across. The wounded outnumbered the able-bodied. There was no food. There had been no food for 96 hours. The men had stripped the bark from the few standing trees and chewed it for moisture. Some had begun to drink from the canteens of the German dead, lying outside the perimeter, crawling out under fire. At 10:30 hours, a stretcher-bearer party of the 308th, recovering wounded along the southern edge of the ravine, was captured by German infantry. Among the captured was Private Lowell Hollingshead, the Ohio farm boy, whose diary entry from the first night reads in the historical record. He was 19. He had been hit twice in the legs. Hollingshead was carried back to a German battalion command post. There he was given food, water, and a typed letter on Imperial German Army stationery. The letter was addressed to the officer commanding the American troops in the Charlevoix ravine. It was signed by Lieutenant Heinrich Prinz of the German 254th Reserve. The letter offered terms. It described the position of the Americans as hopeless. It offered honorable surrender, medical care for the wounded, and the assurance that the men would be treated according to the conventions of war. It asked for a reply. It requested that the bearer of the letter, Private Hollingshead, be permitted to return unmolested with the Hollingshead was blindfolded, walked to the edge of the German line, and released. He carried the letter back into the pocket under a white flag of his own making. He reached Whittlesey's command dugout at 15:10 hours on the afternoon of October 7th. Whittlesey read the letter once. He read it again. He folded it and put it in his tunic. He did not reply in writing. There is no surviving note. There is only what Captain Nelson Holderman and Captain George McMurtry recorded afterward in their official statements to the Division Inspector General, that the Major said 5 words, quietly, before walking out to inspect the line. He said, "They can go to hell." The phrase was misquoted in newspapers the following month as a defiant battle cry. The press attributed to Whittlesey a longer, more theatrical refusal that he never spoke. He spent the rest of his life correcting the record when he could bear to speak of it at all. The 5 words he actually said, according to the men who heard them, were said in the tone of a man too tired to be angry. He ordered the white panels brought down from the... By the evening of October 7th, the perimeter inside the pocket had contracted to the point that the living and the dead could no longer be separated. Bodies of men killed in the first 3 days had been used as cover. Bodies of men killed in the friendly fire barrage had not been moved at all. The medical situation, in the careful language of the after-action report, had passed beyond description. There were 194 wounded receiving no treatment. There were 40 men with untreated head injuries who were no longer conscious. There were 19 who were conscious, but could not be saved. The battalion surgeon had used the last of his iodine on the morning of October 6th. He had been operating with a pocket knife, dressed wounds with strips of his own uniform, and was himself shot through the left thigh at approximately 2000 hours that evening. The temperature inside the ravine that night fell to 41 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no fire. The men were ordered not to light cigarettes. They lay shoulder to shoulder against the cold and waited for what they believed was a final... The assault did not come. The Germans, in fact, had begun to withdraw from sectors of the line. Pressure from the broader Meuse-Argonne offensive was forcing them back across a 30-mile front. The pocket had held them in place for 6 days. The pocket had cost them something they could no longer afford. Read those numbers again. 194 wounded, 40 unconscious, 19 dying. The count of able-bodied men who could still hold a rifle stood at 197. The first 9 entries on this list are the ones the official histories chose to remember. The last one is the one they could not bring themselves to print. The men of the 307th Infantry, a sister regiment of the 308th, also drawn from New York, had been fighting northward through the Argonne since October 2nd. They had taken heavy casualties of their own. They did not know whether the lost battalion still existed. They knew only that General Robert Alexander, commanding the 77th Division, had ordered them to keep advancing until the pocket was reached, or until there was no one left to advance. At 15:30 hours on October 7th, at the same hour, Hollingshead was carrying the German surrender demand into Whittlesey's dugout. A patrol of the 307th crested the ridge above the southern lip of the Somme, Charlevoix ravine. They had been moving for 2 hours through ground the Germans had abandoned that morning. The patrol looked down into the ravine. They did not see men at first. They saw what they took for a field hospital that had been... Then one of the figures below stood up. He was holding a Springfield rifle. He was waving it. The patrol came down the slope at a run. The first American to reach the perimeter was a runner named Krotoshinsky, Abraham Krotoshinsky, a Polish-Jewish immigrant from the Lower East Side who had himself been sent out from the pocket on October 6th and had crawled for 19 hours through German lines to reach division headquarters. He had insisted on guiding the relief column back in. He was the first man to embrace Whittlesey when the line was reached. The official count, recorded in the after-action report of the 77th Division Adjutant, listed 194 men of the original 554 who walked out under their own power that afternoon. 3 more were carried out and survived. The figure that entered the official histories was 109. Read his name again. Abraham Krotoshinsky. He was 24 years old. He had been in the United States for 6 years. He had been in the Army for 10 months. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for what he did on October 6th. He returned to New York after the war and could not find work for years. He died in 19... Major Charles White Whittlesey received the Medal of Honor for his command of the Lost Battalion. So did Captain George McMurtry. So did Captain Nelson Holderman. The ceremony took place at the Capitol in Washington on the 6th of December, 1918. Whittlesey wore his uniform. He shook the president's hand. He returned to New York the following week and resumed his Wall Street. He gave no interviews about the pocket. He refused all requests to write a memoir. When asked to speak at veterans' gatherings, he spoke about the men under his command and never about himself. When letters arrived from the families of the dead, and they arrived for the rest of his life, hundreds of them, asking him to describe how their son or husband or brother had died, he answered everyone personally. He answered them by hand. In November 1921, Whittlesey was asked to serve as a pallbearer at the burial of the unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery. He accepted. He stood beside the casket. He returned to New York that evening. 11 days later, on the 26th of November 1921, Major Whittlesey boarded the United Fruit Company steamer SS Toloa bound for Havana. He dined at the captain's table. He retired to his stateroom shortly before midnight. He left behind letters addressed to his mother, his law partner, his brother, and Captain McMurtry. The letters were sealed in envelopes on. He was never seen again. The note he left for McMurtry, his fellow Medal of Honor recipient, and the man who had stood beside him in the pocket, was the shortest of the four. The contents were entered into the public record by the New York County Surrogate's Court when his estate was probated. He had written, "Just lonely or depressed, I can't." He was 37 years old. He had survived the Argonne. He had received the highest military honor his country could bestow. He had answered every letter from every grieving mother who had ever asked him to describe her son's last hours. And then, one Saturday night in the Caribbean, he had walked out of his stateroom and stepped off the stern of a passenger steamer. The men of the 308th Infantry, those who were still living in 1921, held a memorial for him at the Armory on Lexington Avenue. They did not invite the press. They read his name aloud. Then they read the names of the dead from the pocket. The reading took 47. The men of the pocket did not believe they would be left there to die. They believed, on the morning of the 2nd of October 1918, that they were walking into a coordinated advance. They believed that their flanks would hold. They believed that the army behind them would reach them before the food ran out, before the water ran out, before their own artillery began to fall. 554 men entered the Charlevoix ravine. 197 walked out, the figure that remains uncounted in any official document. The figure no after-action report attempted to record is what the survivors carried home with them. Whittlesey carried it for 3 years before he stepped off the stern of the SS Toloa. Hollingshead carried it for the rest of his life and never slept through a full. Krotoshinsky carried it while he scrubbed federal post office floors in a city that had forgotten his name before he had finished reading the newspapers announcing his decoration. Their names appear on the regimental memorial of the 308th Infantry at Camp Upton, Long Island. The memorial has been moved twice since 1919. It now stands in a small park most people walk past without reading. The names of the dead from the pocket are inscribed in the lower panel. There are 107 of them. They were, on average, 23 years old. Most of them had been born in countries other than the one whose uniform they died in. If you want the history of the Great War without mythology, without sentimentality, without the long shadow of films that turned ravines into spectacles, this channel exists for you. It exists for the men whose names history nearly forgot. Subscribe. The next regiment we owe the truth to is the 369th Infantry, the Harlem Hellfighters, 191 days in the trenches, the Croix de Guerre for valor, the country that sent them home without honor. That story is already in production.